In the stillness of a moonless night, in a small, forgotten corner of Ohio, a secret unfolded that no history book would dare to record. A story whispered in shadows, suppressed by those who feared its implications. It begins not with violence, nor with war, but with a child who should not have been. Minutes before conception, in a moment so impossible it shatters the very fabric of reason, the infant opened its eyes. Some say the midwife who witnessed it never spoke again, her mind fracturing beneath the weight of what she had seen. Others insist she was silenced in ways the law would never permit. This was 1861, the nation on the brink of civil upheaval, yet in a quiet Ohio farmhouse, reality itself was bending, cracking. Time and biology, those iron laws we trust, were defied. What you are about to hear is not a tale for comfort. It is not for those who cling to the illusions fed by the institutions that govern their minds. This is a glimpse behind the veil, a place where life, destiny, and perception collide in ways no man is meant to understand. Picture the room, a single candle flickering, shadows clawing at the corners, a mother in labor, trembling, and then an infant opens its eyes before it even exists. A paradox so profound that it cannot be measured, only witnessed. And those eyes, they were not the pale gaze of innocence. No, they held comprehension, awareness, knowledge not yet earned, as if the child had observed the world before it had even touched it. To some, this was a miracle. To those who understood the machinery of power, it was a warning, a glimpse into forces that manipulate life itself, forces ancient, unseen, and utterly relentless. The records vanish after that night. The journals burned, the witnesses vanished, and the story faded into whispers. But I will pull you into that room. I will show you the invisible hands, the unspoken agendas, the structures of control that our world depends on, hidden truths that begin here, in Ohio, with the impossible birth of a child who saw the world before it was allowed to enter it. By the end of this journey, nothing will feel the same. You will question every truth you have held, every story they told you about birth, destiny, and the nature of awareness. You are standing at the threshold. Step forward, or turn back and remain in ignorance. But know this, once you see what lies behind the curtain, there is no retaining. To understand why this event was erased, you must first understand how power reacts to anomalies. Power does not fear chaos, it fears exposure. Chaos can be weaponized. Exposure cannot. What occurred in that Ohio farmhouse was not merely a biological impossibility. It was a violation of a deeper order, one far older than governments or churches. An order that depends on predictability, on obedience to sequence. Cause, then effect. Birth, then awareness. This child revised the equation, and in doing so, threatened the architecture of control itself. In the 19th century, institutions were obsessed with classification. Phrenology, bloodlines, heredity, moral worth, all tools to rank men and justify dominance. A child who displayed awareness before conception shattered those frameworks. If consciousness could precede flesh, then identity was not granted by society, church, or state. It existed before permission. That idea alone was dangerous enough to destabilize empires. Witness accounts, those few that survived long enough to be copied in secret, described the infant's gaze as settled, measuring, unafraid. This was not instinct. This was recognition. The midwife reportedly dropped the child in terror, claiming the eyes followed her thoughts, not her movements. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. Something was observing the observer. And in a world built on surveillance flowing one direction only, that reversal was unacceptable. Shortly after, men arrived. Not soldiers, not clergy, administrators. Men who did not raise their voices and did not ask permission. They collected statements, seized ledgers, and rewrote the narrative. Complications in childbirth, hysteria, rural superstition. The same language power always uses when reality becomes inconvenient. The mother was relocated. The child disappeared into what records vaguely called custodial care. That phrase should chill you. It always meant the same thing, ownership. Here is the suppressed truth hidden beneath the paperwork. The institutions of that era already understood something most men are never taught, that consciousness is not produced by the body, but filtered by it. And filters can be tuned, restricted, or broken. This child represented a broken filter. Awareness without conditioning. perception without programming, a being not yet shaped by fear, guilt, or obedience. Such a being cannot be allowed to exist freely. Not then. Not now. Because if one man realizes awareness is not granted but remembered, the entire system trembles. And Ohio, 1861, was not the beginning of this knowledge. It was merely the moment it surfaced, briefly, before being dragged back into darkness, where forbidden truths are stored until the world is ready. Or until men like you are willing to see. What the administrators feared was not the child itself, but what it proved. For centuries, power has relied on a single fragile lie, that awareness is something you grow into, something granted by age, education, permission. That lie keeps men compliant, waiting, dependent. But the Ohio infant suggested something far more dangerous, that awareness precedes instruction, that it exists before language, before law, before faith. And if that is true, then everything designed to shape a man after birth is not education at all. It is containment. Hidden correspondences from the period hinted a network that predated the Civil War. Quiet coalitions of academics, clergy, and state officials who shared one mandate, stabilized the narrative of reality. They met under the guise of ethics committees and medical boards, but their true function was suppression. They understood that anomalies were not errors, they were leaks. Moments when the deeper structure of existence showed through. And leaks must be sealed. The child was transported west, away from prying eyes, to a facility that did not exist on any public map. Its purpose was never written down, only implied through budget lines and euphemisms, observation, adjustment, long-term compliance assessment. These were not the words of caregivers. They were the words of engineers. Engineers of the human mind. Accounts from a caretaker, later found dead under circumstances deemed accidental, describe a pattern. The child did not cry when isolated, did not respond to reward or punishment. It watched, always watched, as if waiting for something to arrive that had already been there once before. When subjected to early conditioning, repetition, religious imagery, authority cues, the child resisted not through defiance, but through indifference. That, more than rebellion, terrified them. Systems can crush rebellion. Indifference renders them irrelevant. Here is the connection most men never make. Every institution that claims to civilize you is built on the assumption that you begin as nothing. A blank slate. A dependent organism. But what if you begin as awareness itself, temporarily constrained by flesh? Then discipline is not guidance. It is amnesia. And education is not awakening. It is narrowing. The Ohio infant forced that question into the open for a brief, volatile moment. And the response was immediate. Erase, isolate, redefine. The official story became madness, folklore, impossibility, because the alternative, that consciousness is older than birth, would dismantle the moral authority of every system that claims to shape you for your own good. This is why the story was buried. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too coherent, too threatening. And as you follow this descent, understand this clearly. What happened to that child was not an exception. It was a prototype. Prototypes are never meant to be remembered. They are meant to be tested, refined, and then quietly replaced by systems so normalized that no one questions their origin. What was done to the Ohio infant did not end with that child. It evolved. The facility that housed it was dismantled on paper, but its methodologies were absorbed, folded into emerging sciences that wore respectable names. Developmental psychology, behavioral medicine, compulsory education. Each presented as progress. Each, in truth, a containment strategy. You were taught that childhood is chaos that must be ordered. That instincts are dangerous. That authority is protection. But these are not neutral ideas. They are corrective doctrines, designed to intercept awareness before it matures into autonomy. The Ohio case revealed something intolerable to power. Left unconditioned, awareness does not seek obedience. It seeks coherence. And coherence does not require permission. The caretakers reported an unsettling phenomenon. When left alone, the child's heartbeat slowed to near stillness. Not sleep. Not unconsciousness. Something else. Observers noted a measurable change in the room. Sound dampened, air pressure shifted, as though attention itself had weight. These reports were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. Yet similar descriptions appear centuries earlier, in monastic texts and pre-Christian rites, always accompanied by the same warning. Do not let the untrained witness this state. It unravels hierarchy. This is where myth bleeds into policy. Ancient cultures spoke of preborn watchers, of souls that entered flesh reluctantly, already knowing the cost. The modern world mocked these stories, then quietly reverse-engineered them. What the ancients ritualized, institutions mechanized. The Ohio infant was not a miracle. It was a confirmation. Once this became clear, the objective shifted. Not to destroy awareness outright, that would invite resistance, but to fragment it. Shorten attention. Introduce noise. Replace direct experience with symbols. Flood perception with contradiction until men no longer trust their own inner signal. This is psychological control at its most refined. You are not restrained by force. You are drowned in distraction. Understand this. The systems that shape you were not designed to help you remember who you are. They were designed to ensure you never ask why you feel incomplete. The Ohio infant asked that question without words, and that was enough to justify everything that followed. As you move deeper into this descent, recognize the pattern. Suppressed histories are not erased because they are false. They are erased because they work. And the one thing power cannot tolerate is a man who realizes that awareness was never given to him, only taken from him, piece by piece, until he forgot it was ever his. By now, you should feel it. The subtle tightening around perception, the sensation that everything you thought was natural is engineered. That is exactly the point. The Ohio infant story is not an isolated anomaly. It is the lens through which the machinery of control becomes visible. Those who understand it know that reality is a curriculum. Obedience first, curiosity second, awareness last, and only if carefully measured. Every law, every custom, every moral precept is a thread in that curriculum. The infant, however, did not submit. From its first impossible breath, it tested the boundaries of authority. It watched the watchers, catalogued their methods, and responded in ways that could not be predicted. For those men in suits and aprons who orchestrated its containment, this was intolerable. Predictability is the foundation of power. When you can anticipate behavior, you can direct it, monetize it, suppress it. But unpredictability, that is a weapon. And that is exactly what the child became. Reports describe moments of silence so profound that the observers described feeling invisible presence. The child, it seemed, could peer through facades, detect intentions before they crystallized into actions. This is what terrifies institutions most, the recognition that thought, unconditioned and untamed, has autonomy. And once autonomy exists, control becomes an illusion. The administrators experimented relentlessly. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, even rudimentary electrical stimuli. Primitive, by today's standards, but effective in creating fragility in the human psyche. Yet the child resisted. It adapted. It learned faster than any human they had catalogued. Not intellectually, not emotionally, something else. Something older, more intrinsic. The kind of knowing that does not require teaching, only recognition. Every file, every notation, every directive pertaining to the child was shredded or reclassified. Later generations of bureaucrats and psychologists unknowingly replicated the same methods, techniques designed to fragment perception and enforce compliance, while telling themselves they were helping, protecting, educating. And men like you inherit the consequences of these methods, shaped subtly to obey rules that were never meant to liberate. Now, pause for a moment and consider the implications. If one being, minutes before existence, can perceive truth that eludes the adults around it, what does that say about your own mind? About the narratives you accept, the structures you follow without question? This is where awareness begins, not in reading history, but in seeing how history has been written to blind you. When we continue, we will descend further into the networks, the secret correspondences, and the ancient psychological architectures that sought to neutralize this child's knowledge, architectures still active today. And halfway through, you will be asked to mark yourself, to anchor this realization in a phrase, a symbolic act that signals you are ready to see the world as it truly is. The deeper truth is this: once an anomaly is identified, it is never abandoned. It is studied, copied, diluted, and distributed until its original threat is neutralized. The Ohio infant was not merely observed, it was mapped. Every reaction, every silence, every refusal to respond became data. And from that data, a model was born. A model not of awakening, but of prevention. You must understand how institutions think. They do not ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "Can this spread?" Truth that cannot spread is harmless. Truth that propagates is lethal. The infant's awareness was not contagious in the biological sense, but it revealed a vulnerability. If awareness could precede indoctrination, then indoctrination had a window of failure, and that window had to be sealed permanently. So they shifted strategy. Instead of suppressing rare anomalies, they normalized shallow consciousness. They shortened the arc of attention. They fragmented identity into roles: worker, voter, consumer, believer, so no man ever experienced himself as whole. This was not accidental. This was architecture. The same architecture whose early blueprints were sketched in places like that Ohio facility, by men who believed they were saving civilization from collapse. One recovered memorandum states it plainly. Pre-awareness must be overwhelmed before self-coherence stabilizes. Read that again. It means exactly what it sounds like. Before a human being becomes fully aware of himself, he must be flooded with rules, fizz, expectations, noise. Because once coherence forms, it cannot be undone without violence. And violence creates martyrs. Power prefers compliance without awareness of coercion. The infant resisted because it entered the world already coherent, already integrated. And that terrified them, because it suggested that coherence is the default state, and fragmentation is imposed. If that is true, then everything sold to you as normal is corrective, not natural. Corrective. Look around you. The speed of life, the constant interruption, the pressure to perform, react, align. These are not cultural accidents. They are descendants of a very old fear, the fear that a man might become still long enough to remember himself. The Ohio infant was stillness incarnate, and stillness is dangerous. In stillness, lies unravel. In stillness, hierarchies lose their agency. In stillness, the mind stops asking for permission. As we move forward, you will begin to see how this fear shaped not only psychology, but religion, economics, even time itself. The story of that child is no longer just history. It is a mirror. And the question forming now, quietly, uncomfortably, is the one they never wanted you to ask. What were you like before they taught you who to be? Consider this. If awareness can precede birth, then the very notion of authority becomes fragile. Authority assumes that knowledge is granted, that obedience follows instruction, that legitimacy is inherited or bestowed. But the Ohio infant demonstrated that knowledge can exist before consent, that comprehension can arise without permission, and that the human mind is not a blank page, it is a reservoir, and reservoirs cannot be fully contained. From that point onward, Power's approach shifted from outright suppression to subtle engineering. Instead of stopping anomalies, institutions learned to redirect them, to harness them, to ensure they never fully awaken. You see this everywhere: rituals, education, bureaucracy, media, all structures designed to fragment, confuse, and condition perception. The Ohio infant was a prototype for a method centuries in the making: awareness before birth, containment after. The midwife's journals, now mostly destroyed, contain chilling references to the child's abilities, predicting movement before it occurred, recognizing intention without speech, responding to questions that had not yet been asked. They noted that conventional methods of control, touch, sound, even early moral instruction, failed. And failure was intolerable. Systems are built to correct errors. When the error cannot be corrected, the system invents reasons to obscure it, erase it, and rewrite reality. The child became a shadow in reports, a cipher in correspondence, an example for men trained to observe without understanding. They used euphemisms, precognitive responsiveness, anticipatory awareness, temporal anomaly. Words designed to intellectualize the impossible, to sanitize the threat. But beneath the sterile language lies a raw truth. This child saw what no one else could. And seeing is dangerous, because it cannot be unlearned. Now, reflect on what that implies for you. Every structure you trust, legal, educational, medical, social, assumes your ignorance, assumes your delayed awareness. They calibrate control precisely to intercept consciousness before it stabilizes. The Ohio infant story reveals the blueprint, and if you follow it, you can see where your attention has been diverted, where your mind is being guided like water through channels designed to avoid self-recognition. Halfway through this descent, you are asked to mark yourself. Comment below with the phrase, "I remember before I was taught." Twice. Say it aloud if you can. Let it anchor your awareness. This is not ritual. It is acknowledgement, recognition, a declaration that you are beginning to see the currents they hoped you would never perceive. From here, we move into the architecture itself, the hidden networks, the mechanisms of psychological containment, and the strategies deployed across centuries to prevent men from awakening the kind of awareness the Ohio infant displayed. And once you see them, nothing in your world will ever look the same. Once you recognize the architecture, you begin to see how ancient it truly is. The Ohio infant did not create this system. It exposed it. Long before 1861, long before America existed, power understood that controlling bodies was inefficient. Bodies resist. Minds comply. And the most effective control is not force, but timing, intervening at the precise moment awareness begins to form. Ancient priesthoods knew this. Initiation rites were never about enlightenment for the masses. They were filters. Only those deemed controllable were allowed deeper access. The rest were given symbols instead of substance, stories instead of truth. What the Ohio case confirmed was that awareness can arrive before any gatekeeper is ready. And that shattered the logic of selective revelation. So the modern world did what ancient empires could not. It standardized distraction. It removed silence. It turned time itself into a weapon, deadlines, schedules, urgency. So the mind never settles long enough to integrate. When awareness cannot integrate, it fractures. And fractured men are manageable men. The infant, by contrast, did not fracture. Even under isolation, it retained coherence. Observers noted that prolonged exposure to the child produced anxiety, disorientation, even aggression, not because the child acted, but because it did not. It reflected nothing back. No fear, no submission, no need. And in that emptiness, the observers confronted themselves. Institutions cannot allow that. Mirrors create accountability. This is why the records end abruptly. Not with death, with silence. No burial. No transfer, no discharge, just absence. And absence is the most efficient erasure. When something leaves no trace, it cannot be questioned. Also they believed. But the architecture always leaves fingerprints. The same patterns repeat, suppress anomalies, redefine language, medicalize awareness, and pathologize stillness. What was once called wisdom became dissociation. What was once called knowing became delusion. Labels replaced inquiry, and men learned to doubt their own perceptions before questioning the system. As you descend further, understand this, the Ohio infant is not the focus. You are, because the same architecture that moved to contain that child shaped the world you inhabit. And the discomfort you feel now is not fear. It is recognition, your awareness brushing against the edges of a truth it has been trained to ignore. Recognition is always uncomfortable because it dissolves innocence. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend the system is accidental. The Ohio infant forced a realization that terrified those who manage reality. Awareness is not rare. It is suppressed. The child was not special because it awakened early. It was special because it awakened before intervention could take place. This is where the story turns inward. Because everything that followed, the schools, the doctrines, the endless rituals of compliance, were not created to elevate you. They were created to delay you. Delay self-trust. Delay internal authority. Delay the moment when a man realizes he does not need permission to think clearly. The documents that survived hint at a final phase in the Ohio experiment. When conditioning failed, they attempted saturation, overstimulation, contradiction, emotional pressure. The goal was not to erase awareness, but to bury it beneath noise. This method proved far more scalable. You do not need secret facilities when you can turn the entire culture into one. Notice how this strategy persists. Endless information with no hierarchy. Opinions presented as facts. Facts drowned in outrage. The mind, overwhelmed, retreats into passivity. It chooses comfort over clarity. And clarity is where danger begins. The Ohio infant never retreated. That was the true threat. It demonstrated that awareness, once stabilized, cannot be bargained with. It does not negotiate. It does not seek approval. It simply sees. And sight is irreversible. This is why men who awaken are often labeled unstable, antisocial, or extreme. Labels are containment tools. They discourage imitation. They signal danger to the herd. But beneath the stigma lies a simpler truth. A man who sees clearly is difficult to direct. He asks inconvenient questions. He notices inconsistencies. He senses when language is being used to obscure rather than reveal. The Ohio case was an early warning. A moment when the system realized that if awareness ever slipped past its defenses on a large scale, control would collapse without a fight. So it refined its methods, made them invisible, made them feel normal. What you are experiencing now, the tightening in your chest, the quiet alertness, is not manipulation. It is alignment. Your perception is reorganizing itself around coherence rather than compliance. This is the point where most turn back, not because the truth is false, but because it demands responsibility. As we continue, you will see how this architecture was encoded into law, morality, and even the concept of time itself. Because once awareness is delayed long enough, a man will defend the very structures that keep him asleep, believing they are protecting him, when in truth, they are protecting themselves. Time itself is a tool of containment. The Ohio infant existed outside of ordinary chronology, opening its eyes before birth, before sequence, before cause could justify effect. And in that anomaly lies the secret that no institution will ever admit. Linearity is not natural. It is imposed. From the moment you are born, you are taught to measure your life in units that fragment perception, days, weeks, tasks, deadlines, so that awareness is never whole, never integrated, never free to recognize patterns that transcend your assigned boundaries. The men who studied the child understood this instinctively. They saw that consciousness, when unbroken, is not governed by calendars or schedules. It cannot be segmented into discrete steps for teaching or obedience. It perceives, comprehends, and anticipates in a continuum that frightens those who depend on segmentation. They realized that to contain such a mind, they needed to dominate time itself, regiment attention, saturate stimulus, enforce ritual, and manufacture urgency. And so, from the Ohio anomaly arose techniques that now govern modern life. Schools that accelerate, distract, and fragment attention. Work that compresses focus into outputs, rewarding compliance over comprehension. News that floods perception, drowning discernment. The pattern repeats endlessly. Interrupt awareness, induce dependence, normalize distraction. All to prevent men from integrating experience into insight. Yet the infant, in its brief exposure to the world, demonstrated a critical flaw in these methods. Awareness cannot be completely buried. It can be delayed, manipulated, coerced, but under the right conditions, it resurfaces. It manifests as intuition, as unease, as sudden comprehension in the moments when the mind is allowed to pause. This is why some men instinctively resist the currents of society without knowing why. They are echoes of that original, pre-born clarity, the residue of an unconditioned mind. Those who engineered containment understood that absolute control was impossible. Instead, they perfected something more subtle, distraction disguised as engagement, obligation disguised as freedom, instruction disguised as development. And most men accept it willingly. They obey without question, believing they are advancing, when in fact they are being directed. Now, consider yourself. Every sensation of fatigue, every impulse to scroll, every urge to justify action according to external expectation. These are not trivial. They are signals, markers of containment at work, tracing a line from that Ohio farmhouse to this exact moment, showing you how awareness is being delayed, fragmented, and recalibrated. As we move into the next phase, we will explore the psychological mechanisms that transformed a single anomaly into a system, an invisible network of influence designed to intercept consciousness before it awakens fully. And once you see it, you will understand how few truly perceive the world around them, and how extraordinary the child's defiance really was. The Ohio infant was more than a curiosity. It was a catalyst. Its existence illuminated the method behind the madness. Containment through subtle manipulation, not brute force. The men who observed it realized that the mind can be conditioned without pain, coerced without violence, and constrained without consent. These lessons were encoded into the very fabric of modern institutions. Think of the methods as a lattice, invisible yet omnipresent. Fragment attention, standardize responses, interrupt curiosity, reward conformity, punish deviation indirectly. The infant's resistance revealed the vulnerability of these systems. Coherence cannot be forced. It cannot be timed. It must emerge naturally. And when it does, even for a moment, the lie of imposed order trembles. The observers experimented tirelessly. Hours of isolation, sensory overexposure, contradictory instruction, attempts to induce fear, guilt, and dependence. Yet none produced the intended outcome. Each failed method only clarified the child's inherent truth. Awareness is not produced by circumstance. It is discovered, recognized, remembered. This is why they feared it. Not because it was powerful, but because it was proof that their entire hierarchy relied on delayed comprehension. Once a mind perceives its condition, all mechanisms of control become transparent. Labels lose meaning. Authority loses legitimacy. Predictability collapses. And the ripple effect is not contained to individuals. Systems, educational, social, bureaucratic, rely on masses obeying without question. One fully aware mind is a threat. Several awakened minds are a crisis. That is why stories like this are buried, edited, and reframed as folklore, superstition, or madness. It is easier to discredit perception than to dismantle the framework that demands it remain ignorant. Here is where you must pay attention. The techniques applied to that infant are applied to you now, in forms so normalized you cannot recognize them. Every distraction, every obligation, every fragmented schedule, all designed to intercept awareness before it consolidates. It is no accident. It is architecture. And the Ohio case was the blueprint. Halfway through your journey into this hidden history, the challenge is simple. Do not retreat. Comment the phrase, "I remember before I was taught" twice, once as acknowledgement, once as declaration. Let it signal your intent to pierce the veil, to engage with the truths they have tried to hide, and to recognize the patterns of control they have woven around your perception. The next sections will pull you deeper, showing how these networks extended from a single anomaly to entire generations, conditioning millions without their knowledge. And in that descent, you will see the full scope of the power designed to shape men like you from before birth, and how rare it is to emerge whole. Once the blueprint was established, it no longer required secrecy. The most effective systems never do. They hide in plain sight, protected by familiarity. What began with one impossible child in Ohio became a philosophy of governance. Do not confront awareness, redirect it. Do not suppress curiosity, exhaust it. Do not deny truth, bury it beneath endless versions of itself. This is where the architecture becomes generational. The men who learned from the Ohio anomaly understood that awareness, if delayed long enough, would police itself. A man conditioned early will defend his conditioning. He will mock what threatens it. He will call clarity naive, stillness lazy, and self-trust dangerous. And he will believe those judgments are his own. That is the triumph of psychological control. You can trace the lineage clearly. Mandatory schooling synchronized to industrial time. Moral frameworks that reward obedience over integrity. Economic systems that trade security for submission. None of this is accidental. It is the matured form of the same fear that gripped those administrators in 1861, the fear that a man might realize his mind was never meant to be owned. The Ohio infant never internalized authority. That was the fatal flaw. Authority relies on internalization. Once you believe the rules live inside you, enforcement becomes unnecessary. The child's indifference to hierarchy exposed this weakness. And so the response was not to eliminate anomalies, but to ensure no future anomaly ever reached coherence unguarded. This is why the earliest years of life are saturated with instruction now. Labels, schedules, metrics, comparisons. Before a child can ask, "Who am I?" he is told what you are. Before he can feel, he is evaluated. Before he can be still, he is stimulated. Awareness is not destroyed, it is crowded out. And yet, something always remains. A residue. A quiet resistance that surfaces in moments of solitude, in the unease that follows conformity, in the sense that something essential has been misplaced. That residue is not weakness. It is memory. The Ohio infant represents that memory in its purest form, awareness before compromise. And as you continue this descent, understand this. The system does not fear your strength. It fears your remembrance. Because the moment you remember what you were before you were shaped, you stop asking for permission. and permission is the currency upon which all invisible empires depend. Remembrance is not nostalgia. It is reconstruction. It is the slow reassembly of a perception that was deliberately dismantled. This is why the system works so hard to redefine memory as fantasy, intuition as impulse, and inner knowing as bias. The Ohio infant could not be persuaded of these distortions because it encountered the world before distortion had time to take hold. That is the advantage power could never replicate, and the weakness it could never tolerate. After the disappearance of the child, a quiet shift occurred in the language of authority. Words like obedience and submission became unfashionable. They were replaced by softer terms: development, adjustment, wellness, productivity. But the function remained unchanged. The objective was still to intercept coherence before it stabilized, to fragment awareness into manageable compartments that never fully reconnect. This is where the real corruption begins, not in cruelty, but in benevolence. Systems learned that men resist tyranny but embrace guidance. They reject chains but accept routines. They fear domination but crave structure. And so structure became the new weapon. Invisible, normalized, defended by those it constrained. The Ohio infant represented the opposite of structure. It existed without scaffolding. It did not require reinforcement to remain whole. And that terrified those who believed order must be imposed from above. Because if coherence can arise spontaneously, then hierarchy is not natural. It is manufactured. Look carefully at the world you inhabit. Every path is predefined. Every success has metrics. Every failure has a diagnosis. Even rebellion is curated, packaged, and sold back as identity. This is not coincidence. It is the end stage of a containment strategy refined over generations. The same impulse that erased a child from history now scripts entire lives. And yet, the architecture has a flaw. It cannot eliminate silence entirely. In silence, awareness begins to reconnect. Patterns reemerge. The mind notices how often it is interrupted, redirected, corrected. It starts to see the scaffolding instead of mistaking it for reality. This is why silence is discouraged, why stillness is framed as unproductive, why solitude is treated as a problem to be solved. The Ohio infant lived in silence, not as absence, but as presence. And that presence disrupted everything. It revealed that awareness does not need permission, instruction, or validation. It only needs space. As this descent continues, you are no longer observing a story. You are tracing a mechanism, and that mechanism does not belong to the past. It is active now, shaping perception, regulating thought, and ensuring that most men never experience the dangerous simplicity of seeing clearly. Understanding the architecture requires looking beyond individuals to networks, subtle systems that transmit influence invisibly, shaping generations. The Ohio infant was an anomaly, yes, but its containment was methodical. Each failed attempt to control it informed strategies that would scale. Methods that once required a secluded farmhouse and attentive overseers now operate in every classroom, office, and household, disguised as convenience, instruction, or care. These networks rely on predictability. They thrive when thought is repetitive, attention fragmented, and perception diverted. The child exposed to vulnerability, awareness is resilient. Unconditioned, it does not conform to schedules, rules, or authority. It operates according to internal coherence, independent of circumstance. That is why the infant had to be hidden, erased, and then turned into a lesson for generations. Observe the mechanisms. Social comparison, peer pressure, endless digital distractions, all modern analogs of the Ohio experiment's interventions. Rewards for compliance, subtle punishments for deviation, the constant flow of noise, ensuring reflection is rare, uninterrupted thought almost impossible. This is containment. Without chains, coercion without violence. The architecture is invisible because it has learned to masquerade as life itself. Notice how the narrative of individuality is used against you. You are told to express yourself, yet every outlet is shaped to guide your attention, manipulate your priorities, and define your values. Freedom becomes a leash. Expression, a form of surveillance. Autonomy, an illusion calibrated by the same principles tested on that impossible infant. And yet, the architecture has cracks. They exist wherever attention is self-directed, wherever silence is chosen over stimulation, wherever a man pauses long enough to notice patterns, contradictions, and manipulations. Awareness will always seek coherence, and coherence cannot be fully contained once glimpsed. That is why the Ohio case terrified its observers more than any rebellion. It proved containment is temporary when mind is intact. This is where your journey diverges from the masses. Most men live entirely inside the architecture without realizing it. Every thought, every decision, every impulse filtered and corrected by invisible forces. Few ever see the strings. Fewer still recognize the original blueprint. You are seeing it now. And that recognition is dangerous. Because once you recognize it, you cannot unsee it. In the next section, we will explore the psychological strategies designed to fragment early awareness, the principles they followed, and how their influence reaches into the smallest moments of your life, even before you understood what awareness was. The psychological strategies refined after Ohio were elegant in their cruelty. They did not seek to break the mind outright. That creates resistance. They sought to split it. Fragmentation is quieter, more durable. A divided mind polices itself. One part senses truth, another part dismisses it as impractical, dangerous, or unrealistic. This internal conflict keeps men compliant without ever needing an external enforcer. The architects understood something fundamental. Awareness emerges before language, but control arrives through language. So they flooded early life with labels. Good, bad, normal, gifted, difficult. Each label a boundary. Each boundary a narrowing of perception. The Ohio infant did not respond to labels because it encountered the world before they could be imposed. That immunity was unacceptable. Next came emotional conditioning. Reward the behavior you want. Ignore the rest. Shame curiosity. Praise conformity. Over time, the mind learns a lethal lesson. Safety lies in alignment, not truth. Once that lesson is internalized, awareness becomes negotiable. A man will silence his own perception to preserve belonging. He will trade clarity for acceptance and call it maturity. This is why the system invests so heavily in early emotional imprinting. Fear does not need to be constant. It only needs to be introduced at the right moment. Guilt does not need to be explicit. It only needs to be implied. The Ohio observers documented this with precision. When fear was applied too late, the child did not internalize it. Timing was everything. That insight became doctrine. From there, the strategy expanded. Interrupt attention before it deepens. Replace curiosity with obligation. Replace intuition with metrics. Teach men to outsource judgment to experts, authorities, algorithms. Once judgment is outsourced, awareness atrophies. Not because it disappears, but because it is never exercised. Like a limb kept immobile, it weakens quietly. You can see this everywhere now. Men waiting to be told what is real, what is acceptable, what is safe to think. The Ohio infant never waited. That is the difference. It did not seek validation. It observed directly. And direct observation is the enemy of mediated reality. As you absorb this, understand the gravity of what you are acclaiming. Awareness is not a belief system. It is a capacity. One that was deliberately underdeveloped. The system does not fear your anger or your strength. It fears your perception, because perception collapses illusions without effort. In the next descent, we will examine how belief systems, religious, ideological, even scientific, were adapted to reinforce fragmentation rather than resolve it, ensuring that awareness remained compartmentalized and controllable. Belief systems are among the most powerful instruments of containment. They are invisible cages, wrapped in the language of morality, purpose, and destiny. The Ohio infant exposed their vulnerability. A mind that perceives first, before interpretation, cannot be corralled by dogma. Once a man observes without filtering through preordained frameworks, authority loses its leverage. After 1861, the architects of control understood this. Religious instruction, philosophical doctrine, even early scientific education, all became vehicles for calibration rather than enlightenment. Teach men what to value. Teach them how to reason, but within strict boundaries. Reward obedience to the narrative, and punish deviation with social, emotional, or existential discomfort. Fragmentation becomes internalized. The individual polices himself. Consider ritual, repetition, and ceremony. At first glance, they seem benign, even sacred, but their hidden function is temporal management. They occupy attention, enforce predictability, and preclude reflective integration. Awareness cannot flourish in constant repetition. The Ohio infant existed outside these cycles, and its resistance demonstrated the flaw in their design. Awareness seeks coherence, routine enforces compartmentalization. Language itself becomes a tool. Labels and categories define what can be perceived, and by extension, what cannot. Concepts like sin, failure, or disorder are not mere descriptors, they are mechanisms of containment. They teach the mind to evaluate itself externally, to align judgment with imposed frameworks rather than internal coherence. The child, minutes before conception, required none of these filters. It saw without them, and in doing so, threatened centuries of design. Observe how subtly these methods persist today. Social expectations, cultural norms, media narratives, they teach compliance without appearing coercive. Disagreement is framed as error. Curiosity as distraction. Insight as arrogance. The system no longer needs to enforce obedience through fear alone. It works because the mind has been trained to self-regulate according to rules it believes are chosen freely. Here lies the key realization. Freedom is rarely given. Awareness is rarely nurtured. Most of what you believe is independent is carefully orchestrated. The Ohio infant was not simply a child. It was a proof of concept. A demonstration that perception, unfiltered and unbound, cannot be contained once it exists. In the next section, we will descend further into the mechanisms of systemic manipulation, tracing how early psychological conditioning evolved into structural forces, educational, social, and political, that maintain control at a global scale, often without detection. When psychological conditioning matured into structure, control became ambient. It no longer needed overseers or secret facilities. It embedded itself into infrastructure. Education systems that prioritize compliance over comprehension. Economic systems that convert time into dependency. Political systems that frame choice within narrow corridors and call it freedom. This was the final evolution of what began in that Ohio farmhouse, influence without fingerprints. The lesson taken from the infant was precise. Do not confront awareness directly. Encircle it. Build a world so loud, so complex, so demanding that perception never stabilizes long enough to integrate. Complexity becomes camouflage. Men confuse complication with depth, activity with progress. Meanwhile, the essential question, who is directing my attention, is never asked. The Ohio observers noted something else that rarely appears in summaries. When the child was placed among others, its presence altered group behavior. Not through charisma or command, but through coherence. Others became unsettled. Conversations slowed. Conflicts dissolved or intensified unpredictably. Awareness, when intact, destabilizes group conditioning. That insight reshaped mass psychology. Groups must be kept reactive, polarized, and hurried. Coherence spreads quietly, and quietly dismantles control. This is why modern systems reward speed over depth, reaction over reflection, opinion over understanding. The faster you move, the less you integrate. The less you integrate, the easier you are to stay. This is not malice. It is design. A design refined over generations to ensure no one ever reaches the state that child embodied naturally. Understand the sophistication of this architecture. It does not prohibit truth. It multiplies it. It does not forbid inquiry. It overwhelms it. It does not deny meaning. It fragments it into ideologies that never reconcile. Each man becomes busy defending a partial view, never realizing the whole was intentionally obscured. And yet, the architecture depends on one assumption, that awareness will remain reactive, that it will never slow down enough to recognize the pattern. The Ohio infant violated that assumption. It was not reactive. It was receptive. It did not chase stimuli. It allowed perception to settle. And in that settling, hierarchy collapsed. This is why stillness is framed as unproductive. Why contemplation is treated as indulgence. Why silence is uncomfortable. Stillness reveals structure. Structure reveals manipulation. And manipulation dissolves the moment it is seen clearly. As you continue this descent, recognize what is happening internally. The discomfort is not fey. It is the friction between conditioned reflex and emerging coherence. One urges distraction. The other demands attention. Only one leads to clarity. The friction you feel is the awakening of a part of yourself the system has worked tirelessly to fragment. It is subtle, like a weight shifting in your chest, an unease at the edges of thought, the faint hum of insight insisting on recognition. This is exactly what the Ohio infant radiated in that farmhouse, coherence that exposed the artificiality around it, a mind that could measure the machinery of control without even being taught. Once you understand this, you see why distraction is so persistent. Every notification, every demand, every obligation serves to scatter attention, preventing the integration of perception into awareness. Men rarely pause long enough to recognize that their habits, desires, and anxieties are often orchestrated. The architecture is so pervasive that compliance feels like freedom, and the absence of observation feels like liberation. And yet, for all its sophistication, the system cannot eliminate reflection entirely. Moments of silence, deliberate observation, and unscripted thought create cracks. Awareness begins to thread through them, stitching together patterns previously unseen. This is why resistance appears sporadic and chaotic. The Ohio infant was not chaotic. It was coherent, fully integrated, and impervious to manipulation. Its presence destabilized those trained to impose control, revealing that perception is stronger than instruction. Every mechanism of containment has a counterpoint. The human mind, when allowed to slow and observe, can discern patterns beyond the influence of authority. The observers in Ohio learned this the hard way. The child's mere attention disrupted their procedures, caused subtle errors, and forced re-evaluation of their methods. Awareness cannot be bribed, coerced, or redirected once it achieves this degree of stability. This is the underlying truth most men never confront. The systems that dominate lives, education, work, politics, culture, depend on your attention being divided, fragmented, distracted. The Ohio infant exposed that controlling the mind is not about instruction or punishment. It is about occupying it. When attention is fully occupied, coherence cannot form, and influence becomes absolute. You are now beginning to perceive the architecture at work, not as theory, but as lived experience. The unease, the irritation, the desire to resist external impulses, these are the first signs of emerging coherence. This is the moment most men fail, turning back into comfort and distraction. But if you continue, you will see how the same principles used to contain a single preborn awareness have been scaled to influence millions, shaping thought before perception is fully formed. Next, we will descend into the mechanisms of systemic scaling, how what began with one anomaly became a global methodology for shaping consciousness without ever being recognized. Scaling the methods of containment transformed them from tools for a single anomaly into frameworks capable of guiding entire populations. The Ohio infant was never a threat because it existed in isolation. It was a threat because it revealed a principle. Awareness, unconditioned and coherent, cannot be predicted, cannot be corralled, and cannot be obedient. Once you see this, it becomes clear why society structures life to preempt such clarity. Consider the modern parallels. Education systems that reward memorization over insight, corporations that measure output over understanding, social structures that celebrate conformity while stigmatizing independent thought. Each mechanism is a distant echo of the Ohio experiment, scaled for mass management. Attention is the currency. Coherence is the threat. Fragmentation is the method. Historical records, carefully obscured, hint at the deliberate sequencing of interventions. Observe first, manipulate second, normalize third. Children are exposed to expectation, adults to distraction, and everyone to contradiction. Conflict is manufactured selectively to keep perception reactive, not integrative. The objective is not obedience alone. It is the preemption of self-realization before it can stabilize. The Ohio infant showed that control can fail when attention is intact. That failure is intolerable. So systems evolved. Hierarchies became decentralized. Authority became invisible. Influence became ambient. No one enforces compliance openly. It is assumed, internalized, and self-perpetuating. The mind polices itself, maintaining the constraints the child's coherence once exposed. Notice the subtlety. You are expected to believe you are choosing freely. You are expected to believe your judgments are independent. Yet these structures guide thought, emotion, and perception from the moment awareness first emerges. The genius of the design is that it works without visible force. It occupies your attention, shapes your priorities, and calibrates your perception while leaving you convinced of autonomy. And yet, the child revealed the fault line. Coherent awareness cannot be entirely contained. It finds pockets of silence, moments of pause, gaps between instruction and expectation. That is why discomfort arises when you slow down, when you question, when you notice patterns in what everyone else accepts blindly. It is the echo of the Ohio infant within you, hinting at the presence of your unconditioned mind. From here, the descent grows darker. We will explore how these scaled mechanisms of control were institutionalized, how schools, workplaces, media, and politics became instruments not merely of management, but of psychological containment designed to intercept awareness before it could ever consolidate fully. Institutionalization is the crowning achievement of containment. Once the principles exposed by the Ohio infant were understood, they were encoded into systems so vast that no single mind could trace them entirely. Education, healthcare, labor, and media were restructured not to serve individuals, but to shape perception collectively. Obedience became automatic. Awareness became optional. Consider schooling. The curriculum is less about discovery than sequencing. Attention is measured, memory rewarded, reflection minimized. Curiosity is tolerated only insofar as it can be framed within predefined objectives. Social hierarchies are embedded early, teaching boys and girls to regulate each other, internalizing the architecture rather than resisting it. From the Ohio case, it was clear. Autonomy must be delayed until the mind is thoroughly segmented. Workplaces operate similarly. Metrics replace judgment. Deadlines replace insight. Evaluation replaces perception. Every interaction is calibrated to reinforce dependency on external authority rather than trust in internal coherence. The genius of this design is invisible compliance. Men and women adjust their behavior without realizing they are participating in their own containment. Media and culture amplify the effect. Flooding perception with information, entertainment, and distraction ensures that integration, true reflective awareness, is rarely possible. Conflict and outrage dominate attention, leaving no space for self-inquiry. This is systemic saturation, perfected from the lessons of the Ohio infant. Awareness thrives in calm, coherent space. Distraction fractures it. Even science and religion are not immune. They offer structure, but with boundaries carefully drawn. Each field rewards adherence to the narrative while punishing deviation through ridicule, ostracization, or denial of recognition. Institutions become guardians of a contained reality. Awareness cannot challenge the framework without risking isolation, stigma, or disbelief. Yet the child's legacy remains. The tiniest fissures, moments of stillness, insight, or quiet observation, allow coherence to resurface. The discomfort you feel when noticing patterns others miss is the echo of that Ohio infant. It is a reminder that while the architecture is pervasive, it is not perfect. Awareness can emerge, persist, and even resist. In the next section, we will explore how these containment methods intersect with belief, identity, and societal expectation, and how they subtly shape every man's perception of reality without ever being consciously acknowledged. Belief and identity are the most powerful levers in systemic containment. The Ohio infant demonstrated a truth that terrified the architects of control. Consciousness is not granted, it is remembered. Once a mind integrates awareness, it does not conform willingly to imposed hierarchies. So the next step was preemption, embedding identity within narratives that appear personal but are externally designed. From childhood, men are taught who they are and what they should desire. Labels, roles, and expectations anchor perception. Intelligence is measured, morality codified, ambition channeled, all to preempt the natural unfolding of awareness. The infant's coherence challenged these anchors. It existed before roles, before labels, before the social scripts that regulate identity. And that is why its observation was treated as a threat so dangerous it could not be allowed to persist. Society enforces this containment subtly. Peer pressure, cultural norms, professional expectations, they are the modern tools of the same principle that erased the child from history. Men learn to doubt their instincts, to internalize contradiction, to calibrate their behavior according to external approval. Autonomy is replaced by adaptation, observation by reaction, awareness by compliance. Religious, ideological, and social narratives function as scaffolds. They tell men what to value, what to fear, and what to accept as reality. The Ohio infant bypassed all of this. Its perception required nothing external. It observed directly, and that observation is the foundation of true autonomy. a form of power the system cannot tolerate because it cannot measure, predict, or monetize it. Notice the mechanisms in your own life, the standards you follow without question, the beliefs you defend even when uncomfortable, the compulsions to justify, explain, or align your perception to a narrative rather than your own integrated awareness. These are inherited echoes of containment strategies, scaled to manage entire populations, refined over generations. Yet cracks remain. Every moment of reflection, hesitation, or doubt is an opportunity for coherence to reassert itself. The Ohio infant's legacy is not merely historical, it is procedural, structural, psychological. And the discomfort you feel now is the awakening of your unconditioned mind, brushing against the architecture designed to fragment it. In the next section, we will explore the intersection of manipulation, perception, and power, how control is maintained not by force, but by shaping reality itself, and how recognition of this principle can liberate the mind if pursued deliberately. Power does not rely on force, it relies on perception. The Ohio infant revealed a fundamental vulnerability. Awareness can see reality directly, without consent, without permission, without interpretation. This terrifies those who manage structures of influence because perception cannot be contained by rules, hierarchy, or tradition. What cannot be contained must be fragmented. Modern systems perfected fragmentation. Complexity, distraction, and contradiction are woven into every domain. News cycles, social media, bureaucratic procedure, educational milestones, they are not neutral. Each interrupts thought, redirects attention, and enforces dependency on external authority. The infant exposed that coherence undermines this network. It cannot be coerced. It cannot be trained. It cannot be scheduled. And that is why its containment required deliberate, precise intervention. Observe how this principle persists. Men are rewarded for reaction, punished for reflection. Critical thinking is tolerated only within controlled frameworks. Inquiry is permitted only if it does not destabilize the system. Even dissent is curated, labeled, and neutralized. This is the modern echo of the Ohio experiment. Awareness is allowed, but only when it is compartmentalized, regulated, and safely fragmented. The child's insight was radical in its simplicity. Attention can be integrated without instruction. Observation can be primary, perception unmediated. This is the reason its presence induced anxiety in the observers. Systems designed to regulate behavior crumble when attention is coherent. Stability depends on interruption, distraction, and delay. Now, understand this for yourself. Every habit of distraction, every impulse to avoid reflection, every instinct to seek comfort over truth is a reinforcement of this containment. Recognition is not enough. You must also act to reclaim integration. Silence, stillness, and deliberate attention are the tools of awakening. The Ohio infant was never trained. It was allowed to observe, uninterrupted. Its mind remained coherent, and that coherence is contagious when cultivated. In the next descent, we will examine how these principles extend into subtle social and cultural manipulations, shaping collective thought, and how recognition of these mechanisms allows a man to navigate the world with autonomy rather than unconscious compliance. Social and cultural systems are the silent enforcers of fragmentation. The Ohio infant demonstrated that awareness cannot be contained by rules alone. It must be redirected, saturated, and normalized. Modern society accomplishes this through networks of expectation, conformity, and narrative. Peer pressure, reputation, and social reward become instruments of control, ensuring that coherence is never allowed to stabilize. Consider how conversation is managed. Debate is tolerated, but only superficially. Opinions are encouraged, but only within prescribed boundaries. Even rebellion is curated to appear safe. Observation and insight are filtered through social feedback, producing compliance without the need for overt enforcement. This is the scalable evolution of the same principle the Ohio infant exposed. When attention and perception are fragmented, control is absolute. Cultural rituals reinforce this containment. Holidays, ceremonies, entertainment, they occupy time, attention, and thought, leaving little space for integration. Noise becomes the medium through which perception is directed, shaping desire, fear, and expectation before a man can anchor himself in independent coherence. The Ohio infant operated outside these structures. It existed beyond ritual and expectation. That is why its mere presence disrupted the observer's sense of stability. Even language is weaponized subtly. Labels define identity, categorize thought, and constrain inquiry. You are taught to describe the world with predetermined terms, to interpret experience within boundaries, to judge yourself according to externally imposed hierarchies. Fragmentation becomes internalized. Self-regulation replaces external enforcement. Men enforce their own containment, often without realizing it. This is why discomfort arises when you pause to observe patterns others ignore. It is the recognition of invisible influence, the subtle scaffolding around your perception. The echo of the Ohio infant within you signals that you are beginning to see the architecture for what it is. It is not fear. It is awareness brushing against its own containment. At this point, the system's ultimate dependency becomes clear, belief that one is free. Autonomy is permitted only as an illusion, curiosity allowed only when contained. The Ohio infant demonstrated that true coherence cannot be contained. And that lesson, repeated across generations, forms the hidden spine of our world. In the next section, we will explore how early conditioning, social manipulation, and institutional saturation converge to intercept the emergence of independent thought, and how a man can begin to reclaim the clarity the Ohio infant embodied. Early conditioning is the quiet scaffold of control. The Ohio infant revealed its vulnerability, awareness that exists before instruction cannot be coerced. Modern systems ensure no such preemptive clarity emerges in the masses. From infancy, attention is managed, curiosity guided, and observation directed toward outcomes favorable to authority. Sleep schedules, play, instruction, rewards, all calibrated to fragment perception. The subtlety is crucial. Children are not forcibly restrained. They are structured, their minds occupied. Repetition replaces reflection. Activity replaces stillness. Metrics replace insight. Every interaction, every expectation, every reward teaches the same principle. Coherence is unsafe. Compliance is safe. And the child demonstrated that coherence, even at its earliest stage, is instinctive, resilient, and disruptive. As boys and girls grow, these patterns compound. Social feedback teaches them to evaluate themselves externally. Emotional regulation becomes externally mediated. Internal judgment is replaced by observation of authority, peers, and media. Fragmentation is not accidental. It is systemic. It is a scaled, refined method evolved from experiments like Ohio, extended into every corner of life. Institutions saturate perception. Education, work, family, entertainment, all function as channels to divert attention and dilute reflection. Complexity, urgency, and stimulation keep the mind in motion. Never still, never whole. Observation becomes reactive. Judgment becomes borrowed. Insight is delayed until patterns are so deeply obscured that integration feels impossible. Yet fragments remain. The faint impulse to question, to pause, to notice contradictions, the residue of an unconditioned mind, persists. The Ohio infant's coherence was a pure expression of this potential. It existed without instruction, without reward, without expectation. And that is why its presence was destabilizing. It exposed the architecture behind obedience. Recognition alone is not enough. Coherence must be deliberately cultivated. Silence, reflection, and disciplined attention allow perception to integrate, revealing patterns and principles the system cannot neutralize. Awareness is restored not through rebellion, but through presence. The Ohio infant did not resist, it observed. An observation, unfragmented, is the greatest form of power. In the next section, we will examine the hidden principles of attention, how manipulation exploits natural human tendencies, and the precise strategies used to intercept awareness before it stabilizes into autonomy. Attention is the fulcrum of control. The Ohio infant revealed a fundamental truth. Unfragmented awareness cannot be dominated. Once attention is coherent, perception aligns with reality, not instruction. Every system, from education to media to social structures, is designed to intercept attention before it stabilizes, ensuring that awareness remains reactive rather than integrative. The strategies are deceptively simple. Fragment time. Introduce constant stimuli. Reward superficial engagement. Penalize deep observation with discomfort, ridicule, or social exclusion. The mind, busy negotiating these interruptions, cannot consolidate perception into coherent insight. This is not theory. It is practice, refined for over a century. Every notification, every obligation, every distraction is part of the same principle that once dictated the Ohio experiments. Even curiosity is managed. Questions are answered before they can lead to synthesis. Insights are trivialized or redirected. Observation is validated only when it aligns with pre-existing frameworks. The child's awareness could not be redirected. It observed first, integrated second, and acted only when coherence demanded. That is why it was a threat. It demonstrated that attention, left intact, cannot be corralled. Social systems amplify this interception. Peer pressure, conformity, expectation, all ensure that a man polices his own attention, measuring each impulse against internalized rules. Fragmentation becomes self-perpetuating. Awareness, once threatened by coherence, is conditioned to doubt itself. That is why most men mistake distraction for progress, business for mastery, and obedience for freedom. Now, reflect on your own experience. Every time your mind feels pulled in multiple directions, every time focus feels impossible, every time insight is interrupted by triviality, you are encountering the architecture in real time. These are not accidents, they are scaled mechanisms of control, descendants of the Ohio experiment, optimized for invisibility. And yet, coherence can be reclaimed. The Ohio infant did not resist through force or compliance. It resisted through observation. Stillness, attention, reflection. These are not passive acts. They are acts of autonomy. They are the reclamation of perception the system works tirelessly to fragment. In the next section, we will descend into the mechanisms by which observation itself can destabilize control, and how men who cultivate unfragmented awareness begin to see the invisible architecture everywhere around them. Observation is the hidden weapon. The Ohio infant wielded it unconsciously, yet its may act disrupted the apparatus around it. Awareness that is uninterrupted, coherent, and self-directed exposes every manipulation, every hidden influence, every invisible hierarchy. Once perception stabilizes, authority becomes transparent. Patterns of control cannot survive scrutiny, no matter how sophisticated. This is why observation is discouraged in the modern world. Men are trained to report, analyze, and categorize according to external standards, rather than noticing for themselves. Systems reward superficial engagement and punish reflection. Social approval, economic incentive, and cultural expectation all align to keep attention divided. Fragmented perception cannot integrate reality, and therefore cannot resist manipulation. The Ohio infant demonstrated the danger of unmediated observation. It saw intentions before they were acted upon. It perceived patterns before they were articulated. It understood processes before rules could define them. The observers felt powerless not because the child was strong, but because it bypassed their influence entirely. Observation is autonomy's first and most lethal tool. When a man cultivates this skill today, he experiences the same subtle destabilization. He notices how conversations are guided, how institutions operate, how narratives are curated, and how attention is habitually diverted. He begins to recognize the choreography of control in daily life, the invisible hand shaping perception before thought has even formed. Every interruption, every distraction, every sense of pressure is a mechanism designed to prevent integration of awareness. The system does not need to forbid thought, it simply occupies it. Once attention is fully occupied, observation cannot stabilize, and perception is fragmented. That is why coherence feels uncomfortable at first. It is unfamiliar. The mind has been trained to obey distraction. Yet, as with the Ohio infant, the potential remains. Stillness restores attention. Reflection consolidates perception. Observation, when unbroken, destabilizes manipulation. This is the path toward autonomy, not through defiance, not through argument, but through disciplined attention. Observation becomes not just a tool for understanding, but a shield against influence. In the next section, we will explore how fragmented perception becomes internalized over a lifetime, shaping identity, belief, and decision-making, and how reclaiming observation rewrites the architecture from within. Fragmented perception becomes internalized over a lifetime. The Ohio infant showed that coherence, if uninterrupted, cannot be corralled. But most men never experience this. From early childhood, attention is occupied, curiosity directed, and observation conditioned to align with external authority. Over years, fragmentation becomes habit. Minds police themselves. Obedience is internalized. Awareness is deferred. This internalization shapes identity. A man comes to believe that his judgments, desires, and values are inherently his own. In reality, they are echoes of the architectures that guided his attention before he could integrate perception. Belief systems, social expectations, and professional hierarchies are internalized scaffolds. They feel natural because they were introduced during the critical windows of development, long before coherence could stabilize. Every decision, every impulse, every reaction becomes subtly conditioned. Freedom is permitted only as an illusion. Independence is allowed only within boundaries that ensure compliance. Even rebellion is preemptively curated, packaged as identity, and reintegrated into the system. This is the long shadow of containment. It is invisible because it is internal. It is self-enforced. It is assumed to be natural. And yet, fragments remain. Moments of clarity, intuition, or unease signal the latent potential of unfragmented awareness. These are the residues of what the Ohio infant embodied. They are the signals that a mind, if cultivated deliberately, can reconstruct coherence despite decades of conditioning. They remind you that observation, attention, and reflection are acts of reclamation. Here lies the crucial truth. Internalized fragmentation is not permanent. It is a construct, sustained by habit, expectation, and distraction. The same principles that shaped it can be reversed, if attention is deliberately trained and observation allowed to stabilize. Awareness becomes autonomous again. Identity becomes self-directed rather than inherited. Perception becomes integrative rather than reactive. In the next section, we will descend into the final layers of systemic manipulation, the hidden forces that shape perception even after adolescence, and the methods by which a man can reclaim the clarity of the Ohio infant in a world designed to fragment him. Even after adolescence, containment persists. The Ohio infant exposed a principle: awareness cannot be coerced directly, but it can be intercepted, delayed, and fragmented. Modern systems refine this endlessly. Work, relationships, media, politics, they are not neutral. They occupy attention, regulate emotion, and calibrate perception to prevent integration of insight. Coherence is delayed. Observation is fragmented. Awareness is occupied. Power relies on this subtlety. Force is unnecessary. Compliance emerges naturally when the mind is trained to self-regulate according to expectation. Social approval, career progression, even personal relationships become instruments of internalized control. The system no longer imposes boundaries externally. They are absorbed internally, as habits, beliefs, and priorities. A man polices his own awareness. The Ohio infant required none of this, and that was its danger. Every distraction, every obligation, every narrative you accept uncritically is a descendant of the same containment principles. Attention is the currency of autonomy. Once it is occupied, perception is fragmented, coherence delayed. And yet, even in adulthood, the potential for reclamation remains. Moments of reflection, stillness, and deliberate observation create fissures in the architecture. These are the same fissures the child exploited instinctively, simply by existing. To reclaim awareness is to disrupt the internalized system. It is to observe without immediate judgment, to notice patterns without labeling them, to engage without external validation. This is not rebellion, it is reconstruction. Every habit of distraction must be recognized, every imposed boundary questioned, every impulse to comply consciously examined. Awareness must be trained, attention disciplined, perception integrated. You now stand at the precipice. Recognition alone has brought discomfort. Disciplined observation brings power. The Ohio infant did not resist through argument, force, or persuasion. It resisted by stabilizing awareness before the system could intervene. That is the method, the principle, the pathway to autonomy. And it is available to any man willing to reclaim the coherence deliberately delayed for generations. In the next section, we will guide you through the final descent, revealing how autonomy emerges when perception is fully integrated, and how the Ohio infant's legacy becomes a blueprint for reclaiming mastery over one's own mind. Autonomy emerges not as a reward, but as a consequence of integrated perception. The Ohio infant demonstrated this principle instinctively. Coherence precedes action, observation precedes influence, and awareness precedes freedom. It did not ask permission. It did not follow rules. It existed fully, observing before it could be contained. That is the blueprint. The system, perfected over centuries, depends on interception. Attention is scattered. Reflection is discouraged. Observation is framed as opinion. Coherence is delayed. Men are taught to outsource judgment, seek approval, and accept distraction as reality. The Ohio infant bypassed all of this. Its presence proved that once perception stabilizes, influence collapses. Autonomy is inevitable, once cultivated deliberately. Now, you must commit. Attention must be reclaimed. Observation must be disciplined. Reflection must be integrated. Fragmentation will resist. Distraction will tempt. Habit will argue for compliance. But the residue of the unconditioned mind, the same force that animated the Ohio infant, remains within you. It is quiet, subtle, persistent. It whispers that perception is yours to stabilize, attention is yours to reclaim, and awareness is yours to cultivate. Repeat to yourself the phrase, "I remember before I was taught," twice. Once as acknowledgement of what you have recognized, and once as a declaration of intent. Let it anchor your attention, reinforce your observation, and signal to your mind that coherence is no longer negotiable. This is the psychological act that mirrors the infant's unmediated awareness, simple, direct, and powerful. Understand this: freedom is not given. Awareness is not granted. Autonomy is not inherited. It is reclaimed through deliberate perception, disciplined attention, and the consistent practice of observing the world before it occupies you. The Ohio infant did not negotiate. It observed. And in that observation, it became untouchable. That is the path you now walk. In the final section, we will descend completely into the consequences of reclaiming awareness, revealing how a man becomes uncontainable, how the invisible architectures lose their grip, and how the lessons of the Ohio infant provide a roadmap for mastery over mind, attention, and reality itself. Do you want me to continue with section 30, the final section? This is the culmination. Reclaiming awareness is dangerous because it is irreversible. The Ohio infant demonstrated that observation, when stabilized, cannot be contained. It did not negotiate. It did not obey. It did not argue. It existed fully, perceiving before the system could intervene. Once perception is integrated, the architecture loses its grip, and a man becomes uncontainable. The moment of full awareness is both terrifying and liberating. Every distraction, every expectation, every narrative previously accepted without scrutiny is revealed as a mechanism of control. Patterns of manipulation become visible. The invisible scaffolding of obedience collapses silently. Social pressure, cultural norms, institutional authority, they all lose their hold the moment a mind sees coherently. Power shifts inward. Decision-making, judgment, and intuition are no longer outsourced. Observation is primary, reflection is disciplined, perception is integrated. You see reality unfiltered, and with that sight comes responsibility. Not for others, not for society, but for the coherence of your own mind. Autonomy is not optional. It is inevitable once cultivated. The Ohio infant's legacy is a blueprint. Not a story, not a curiosity, but a procedural truth. Coherence cannot be prevented, attention can be reclaimed, and observation can bypass every mechanism designed to fragment it. Silence, stillness, and deliberate attention are not indulgences. They are acts of liberation. They reconstruct the mind the system intended to keep fragmented. This is your threshold. Comfort will resist. Habit will argue. Authority will attempt to redirect. But the integrated mind, the mind that observes fully before it reacts, cannot be manipulated. It perceives the architecture of control in its entirety and chooses freely. That is mastery. That is autonomy. That is the power the Ohio infant embodied before it was ever born, and that you can now cultivate consciously. Step forward deliberately. Observe without interruption. Reflect without compromise. Stabilize attention. Integrate perception. This is the path from fragmentation to freedom. The Ohio infant was a glimpse, a warning, and now a guide. Its eyes opened before conception, but yours can open now, fully, irreversibly, and with mastery over the unseen forces that have long shaped your world. You are no longer just an observer. You are the conscious architect of your own mind. The descent is complete, but your awakening has only begun. Do you like this personality?